Come with me.
We must leave King's Landing quickly, and we will not return for some time.
Come with me.
I want to fly with you on Dragonback, see the great wonders across the narrow sea, and eat only cake.
Okay, so the internet was very normal about that one. Overall, I would say that this was a solid episode 8 of a 10-episode season, which is what it was clearly supposed to be, but it wasn't really successful as a finale. Overall, I did really like this season. I have some questions and some concerns going forward, but overall, I like what they're cooking here. I do think that this season was kind of messy and underwritten in lots of parts, especially in the back half, but given the larger production issues, I can't really blame them for most of that. Before I get into the actual episode, I need to acknowledge the ways that this show was incredibly fucked over by corporate bullshit. The season was cut from 10 episodes to 8 episodes as little as a month before they started filming. They had to film during the writer's strike, so they couldn't make any changes on set, and they had to deal with some serious budget cuts. There was a natural ending point that this season was clearly building towards that they got cut off from. Now, I think that they could have made it to that ending point within 8 episodes in a very satisfying way, but budget cuts were also a factor. They could only afford 2 big dragon sequences, Rook's Rest and the Red Sewing, so that really limited the amount of story that this season could cover and slowed down the pace. Budget cuts also seem like a very plausible reason why some of the subplots felt so sparse, like Rhaenyra's time in the Vale or Jace's time in the North. If you can't afford to build an interior Winterfell set, you can't actually do that much in that location. The third obstacle, I think, is just the nature of the source material. Fire and Blood is already incredibly sparse, and they could only cover a limited amount of that text, and the show has decided to make Rhaenyra, Alicent, and Daemon its 3 main characters, but those characters just aren't doing very much during this portion of the book. So they had to kind of invent and stretch out existing plot lines. I think that this show is a fascinating case study in adapting a text. I actually had a section of this review that was going to discuss the adaptational choices and the recent George R.R. Martin blog post drama, but that got so long that I think it's going to be its own video, so that'll be out at some point, probably. Honestly, I find book purism for a text like Fire and Blood incredibly silly coming from anyone who isn't George R.R. Martin himself.
You all bore me.
I think that there's a reason that these events were written as a fake history and not novelized. Adapting a text like Fire and Blood is orders of magnitude harder than adapting A Song of Ice and Fire, because it doesn't really have characters or plot, just the outlines of them. In my opinion, most of the changes from the source material have been for the better, including the omission of Maelor. Like, sorry, George, but we really don't need that idiot flop baby. It's fine for George R. R. Martin or anyone to dislike the changes made here, but they are part of the game, especially for a text like Fire and Blood. And I just really don't think that the book-accurate show a lot of people seem to want would be nearly as good as they think it would be. The show's biggest problems don't really have much to do with diverging from the source material, at least not yet, but I also really do not see anything that they have changed that they cannot compensate for in the future. There's no reason that this adaptation can't hit the major important beats of the Dance of the Dragons and do it in a satisfying way, as long as it gets the budget and the episodes to do so. Ultimately, the real villain of this season is David Zaslav. Overall, I liked more of this season than I disliked. I do think I like where the story is going and what they are doing with it. I thought each individual episode was decent to fantastic, and I really loved talking about them and making these videos. I don't think that this season as a whole landed quite the way that it should have, and while some of that is definitely attributable to the production issues, some of it is not. But really, the worst thing about this show and this season is the fandom. That's part of why I waited so long to make this. The discussion has just been such a shit show. And people have left really lovely comments on my videos for the most part. Like, thank you guys, I really appreciate it. There are plenty of wonderful, intelligent, and thoughtful people in this fandom too. It just sucks that they get drowned out by the loudest, most obtuse voices. Like, I think that we're gonna have to nuke Reddit, you guys. It's for the good of humanity. Okay, so let's get into the actual episode. In this episode, we get Aemond's first major atrocity. Look at the state of his hair. Also, he burns a town and kills thousands of people. Aemond lashes out violently when he feels insecure and vulnerable, and now he is vulnerable in the one way he never thought he would be. Now, we do not actually see Aemond do this, and I don't think that we needed to. I think in terms of pacing for this episode, it would have been good to get a bit of action, but I'm guessing there was a budget restriction here. What we do see is a close-up of Vhagar that zooms back to Aemond as they both take a moment to serve some face before going back for round 2. And this is very effective on a character level because it shows that this is more than just an act of impulsive rage. It is a methodical and thorough slaughter. Vhagar is grinning. We hear her growl from a still molten mouth. She is in her element and she is thriving. Aemond looks almost intoxicated. He is basking in the flames and screams just as Rhaenyra did last week. Now there could be a tactical strategy to attacking a town declared for Rhaenyra, but he did not have to go back and burn it even more. That was because he wanted to. And I loved the cut from the burning of Sharp Point to a close-up of Aegon, another victim of Vhagar's flames. There is another logistics and timing issue here. Dragons fly faster than ravens, so how would word of Aemond burning Sharp Point make it back to Larys and King's Landing before he did? Unless he had a little post-mass murder spa weekend with Vhagar, and once again, look at his hair, that boy was nowhere near conditioner. Or unless the Larys is a skin changer theory is legit and he's been warging into various birds. Now I speculate that some of the timing might be wacky because Aegon and Larys fleeing King's Landing is something that would have happened in a theoretical episode 10, but was forced forward to close out Aegon's arc for the season. Not everyone in this episode is eager to burn civilians. Helaena refuses to join the war. Both Baela and Hugh are disturbed by Rhaenyra's intention to subdue Lannisport and Old Town. I'm not sure I fully understand this plan. I understand why she would want her new dragon riders to get some experience before taking on Vhagar, and attacking the green armies with big dragons makes sense. Solid plan. But what good will burning the cities do if they do not have armies to hold them? Okay, future me here. I do think I understand this plan actually. The cruelty is the point.
We must break the will of our enemy, or more will die in a struggle that stretches on without end.
Rhaenyra is commanding atrocities and then justifying them by saying that they will prevent more horrors in the future. She's doing what she did last episode at a larger scale.
With these 2 dragons added to our number, the enemy will have no choice but to give way, and peace will be restored. Alone without allies, he will have no choice but to surrender.
This should be incredibly disturbing and set off alarm bells, but because of her vacillation elsewhere in the episode, the enormity of it just doesn't land. And I think that's a central failure of the episode. We should be horrified about where this is going, not confused. Now, Rhaenyra needs to be told by Corlys to use her new dragons, which feels like a step back in her arc from last episode. Perhaps some of this is trying to distance herself from responsibility. Rhaenyra still wants to see herself as right and just, and this allows her to believe that she is only doing what her hand advised. But the scene on the docks did lead to the funniest moment of the episode, Rhaenyra not remembering Daemon's name.
The third brother is untested.
Rhaenyra had convinced herself that more dragons would allow her to win the war bloodlessly, that they could be a deterrent. It was her justification to herself for sacrificing so many people.
Suffering will be ended, and without bloodshed. God's willing.
But that was always a fool's hope, and they could easily have had Aemond's actions radicalize her that last step to fully send her dragons to war because she believes she must.
Aemond thought himself invincible. He has now discovered he is not. He will be angry, desperate. He will not stop at Burning Sharp Point, and he will not be denied.
I don't mind not seeing the burning of Sharp Point, but the sheer horror of it should have made a greater impact, especially since Rhaenyra is planning on doing the same. And I can see how there is no good option for her here. As a leader, she can't afford to be seen as weak.
There are those who have mistaken my caution for weakness.
I fucked up, I know that, but Jesus, can a girl just do the best she can?
Rhaenyra has learned that she needs to be feared. Can she afford to be merciful here, or must she answer outrage with outrage? The fact that Rhaenyra tried so hard for peace makes her character evolution more tragic, but at a certain point, refusal to take action doesn't feel like compassion, but a failure to acknowledge the reality of the war she is fighting. I didn't mind her expressing her concern about the consequences of her decision in the scene with Mysaria, but I do think that she should have been more resolute in making it. I think the decision to send the dragons out like this is a great dark step forward for her character, but when the waffling goes on for an entire season, it gets stale. I just wish we got more of her maniacal messiah vibes from last week, but maybe some of that is for my own reasons. I am glad that she's at least wearing a cape again. I really hope she keeps wearing capes. Cristoncole has come face to face with the terrifying reality of dragon warfare, and he has lost his faith in everything. When Gwaine confronts him about sleeping with Alicent, he doesn't try to deny anything. I never would have predicted going into this season that Cristoncole would have one of my favorite arcs, but he is fully in his nihilism era, and he is dropping some absolute bars.
The dragons dance, and men are like dust under their feet. And all our fine thoughts, all our endeavors are as nothing.
Criston is a common-born man who rose from son of a steward to knight of the Kingsguard to Lord Commander and then Hand of the King. And this ultimately led to feeling corrupted by those who granted him this status. Criston lost his faith in Rhaenyra, and after that, Alicent was the beacon he followed. In this episode, we are reminded that Alicent stopped Criston from killing himself. He became suicidal after the fallout of his night with Rhaenyra, and now he has carried on a continued sexual relationship with Alicent, which is a suicidal act in and of itself. Alicent was his reason to live, then the thing that damned him, and now the relationship has fallen apart. I wasn't sure how I felt about their affair at the beginning of the season, and I still don't know if I love it, but I do think it makes sense for the characters and their journeys this season. It would have really helped to see how it started, and I didn't love tying it to Blood and Cheese the way they did, but I get why they did it. Both Criston and Alicent's arcs this season have been about disillusionment with everything they previously believed in. It doesn't seem like they even enjoyed the sex all that much. It became an extension of their self-hatred. They gave in to desire, and it turned to sludge. Cole has broken his oath again, repeatedly, and it has broken him. Criston got something of his groove back on his little war crimes tour of the Crown Lands. He was confident in his martial prowess, and he believed having Vhagar on his side would guarantee easy victory. And he did win that battle, but it was the definition of a Pyrrhic victory, and it traumatized him to his core. Criston thought that his martial skill and prowess could be used to protect the righteous and dispense justice on the rest, but sinners and saints both burn the same. His honor or lack thereof, his newfound status as Hand of the King, mean nothing. He means nothing against a dragon. And Alicent has also learned that none of her experiences or her status as Dowager Queen mean anything. They both have shaped their lives around their sense of duty, and both realize how hollow and pointless that duty really was. And I think this is a great development because both of these characters had to unlearn their sense of self-righteousness to grow. But they have developed to different ends. Alicent seeks to escape, and Criston seeks annihilation.
To die will be a kind of relief. Don't you think?
I love that this episode in this season has highlighted just how transgressive giving dragons to common-born people is. Aemond and Jace both view it as their sacred birthright that has been violated. Aegon can scarcely believe that Rhaenyra could have found new dragon riders. It was thought to be impossible. I also love how this season has established the dragon seeds as characters. Hugh and Ulf are presented as entirely unsympathetic in Fire and Blood. They're just brutes. But here we get characterization and backstory and distinct motive. Ulf immediately let his newfound power and status as a dragon rider go to his head, and he is flaunting his disregard for decorum. And it's very stupid of him to behave this way, but what can Rhaenyra or Jace actually do here? They need him to win this fight. This is definitely a different side of Ulf. Not that he has ever cared for etiquette, but he is clearly good at endearing himself to people when he needs to. This behavior probably isn't a result of the bond with Silverwing influencing his personality, although I would love it if the sophisticated, classy lady dragon was secretly a huge asshole.
Silverwing's a goer, she is.
But I think Ulf is behaving like this because now he can get away with it. Adam and Hugh, on the other hand, both seek to comport themselves and to follow the customs of the class they aspire to. Hugh was raised by a Targaryen princess, and we saw him make a petition before the king. It makes sense that he would know how to behave around royalty. And Adam sees this as an opportunity to finally achieve the honor and status he feels he and his brother were denied. He wishes to prove his worth and his loyalty. But Ulf doesn't seek to prove himself to anyone. He already has a dragon. Why would he need to? Ulf is such a fun consequence of Rhaenyra just letting the dragons choose with zero screening process for the applicants. I think Rhaenyra thought that if she let the dragons speak, they would choose riders who are noble and worthy in spirit, if not by birth. She sees the dragons as gods, therefore those chosen by the dragons would be ordained. And what does it mean to Targaryen exceptionalism if a dragon chooses someone like Ulf? And Jace is fuming about Ulf. This is exactly what he feared. If someone like Ulf can have a dragon, Vermax is no longer a symbol of his legitimacy. Jace's classism is certainly not pretty, but for him this could quite literally be life and death because he needs the trappings of power to secure his place as the heir to the throne, and his claim has just become far easier to challenge. Jace resorts to fear and intimidation, but that will only get him so far against people with larger dragons.
If you hinder our efforts through sloth or unreadiness, I will see you hanged and your body fed to the dogs in the street.
I love that we have the contrasting stories of Jace, a bastard who is not a Velaryon by blood, but is legally recognized as legitimate and was raised as a prince and carries the Velaryon name, with Adam and Alan, who are Velaryon by blood, but are not permitted to carry the name or the status of being the sons of the sea snake. Like his brother, Alan tries to hide his parentage, but I really wonder how much the other sailors know. He is still shaving or covering his head to conceal his silver hair, but I feel like it would be an open secret. Rhaenys did come up to him and weirdly touch his face in public. He is also navigating his newfound status as Corlys's first mate and processing his resentment with his father. Adam and Alan were just as much Corlys's sons as Laenor, but they were ignored and left to suffer. I loved the scene with Alan and Corlys, and I thought that Abubakar Salim was incredible, but I do wish that this had happened a bit earlier in the season. But hey, at least someone mentioned Laenor. He hasn't fallen through a crack in space and time that completely erased him from everyone's memory. Moving on from literal bastards to figurative, let's talk about Aegon. Aegon is an equal parts despicable and tragic character, and that's what makes him so compelling. He is immensely privileged, but also undeniably a victim of the system. His story illustrates how being a monarch is inherently dehumanizing. This season showed how even the most ostensibly powerful people can still feel powerless, that power can be a cage. Aegon and Rhaenyra both struggled with feeling like they could do nothing to aid their own causes. They both worried they were perceived as weak.
What would you have me do, Mother?
What would you have me do?
Rhaenyra only didn't recklessly fly into battle because she has a better support system. Aegon is unsure if he even wants to go on living. When he finds out about Rhaenyra's new dragons, he asks what it was all for. Aegon has lived his life as a hedonist, and now he is in constant pain and, well...
My cock is destroyed, did they tell you that? Yeah. It burst into flames like a sausage on a spit.
This is what being king has led him to. Aegon was put in this position against his will, and while he has done heinous things, and I can't say I feel particularly bad about a rapist being castrated by fire, I also can't say that he deserves this. I don't think anyone does really, maybe save people who have done this level of violence to others. Aemond probably deserves this. Aegon never wanted to be king, but he did want to be loved and valued. He wanted what Rhaenyra had in the love of the people and the love of their father. When the common people cheered for him at his coronation, he felt affirmed for the first time. That was probably the best moment of his entire life. He doesn't truly care about the people's wants and needs, but he does crave their reverence, and Larys knows exactly how to play to that. He convinces Aegon to flee the city by telling him that he will eventually return a beloved rebuilder.
Aegon the Victorious, risen from the ashes.
Aegon bleakly jokes about the people calling him the Realm's Delight, which was a nickname given to Rhaenyra by the common folk in her youth. This was made reference to a couple times in the first season.
She was my only child. The Realm's Delight.
Aegon did what he did because he wanted to prove himself a worthy king, and it left him crippled and dragonless. But he has actually proven himself stronger than anyone believed. He survived dragonfyre. He has endured the hardships of recovery and made remarkable progress. Aegon has charisma and the ability to charm when he needs to. He is the only person in this family who actually has friends. And maybe they're partly hanging around with him because he's the king, but they also seem to genuinely enjoy his company. And he's kind of an idiot, but he shows a willingness to listen to advice as long as he's not being berated. In another timeline, maybe Aegon really could have been a beloved ruler. But that feels all but lost to him now. The Aegon and Larys stuff has been excellent this season, and I cannot wait to see what kinds of wacky hijinks they get up to on their road trip to Braavos. This was not in the book. Aegon just disappears and no one knows exactly where he is or what he is doing for a while, so we have no idea what this plotline is going to be. Larys's interactions with Aegon here are so compelling because he is being manipulative but also emotionally honest. Larys wants to use Aegon to advance his own power, but he also wants to help Aegon regain his own power. Aegon represents not just a way to power, but a way to vindication for Larys. Larys has been one of the most canny players of the game thus far. He knows how to find people's vulnerabilities, and he knows how to use his own to mask his own true deviousness. Earlier in this season, I compared Aegon's arc to Theon, and while I still think there are similarities, it now seems a bit closer to Book Tyrion. If you only watched Game of Thrones and haven't read A Song of Ice and Fire, Tyrion's arc is quite different from the show. After he escapes King's Landing for Pentos, he becomes darker and more vengeful. Larys's monologue in episode 6 was also quite Tyrion-coded. With Larys as his new mentor, it seems unlikely that Aegon will grow any kinder or seek to atone for his sins. Like Book Tyrion, he will escape to Essos and seethe over being betrayed by his own family. In this episode, Helaena and Aemond exchange dialogue for the very first time, which is wild given that these two characters are siblings and have been on the show for 12 episodes before this. On his return to King's Landing, Aemond tries to recruit Helaena to do war crimes with him. She politely declines, and he takes it very normally.
Bro, calm down.
Now, he isn't wrong that they need Dreamfyre to defeat Rhaenyra's dragons. His desperation here is understandable. Yes, he is partly responsible for the desperate state because of the time that he burned their other dragon rider, But Sunfyre is just a little guy. Even if he was whole and healthy, they would still need Dreamfyre to stand a chance against all of Rhaenyra's dragons. Now, I was interested in the theories that Helaena and Aemond might have some kind of a secret relationship based on something from the books that is a major spoiler and I guess is totally meaningless now, and apparently the canon was changed, so never mind. And because I always want the funniest possible thing, there was a part of me that was rooting for Aemond to be the father of Helena's kids, because it would have been hilarious if neither Aegon or Rhaenyra had a single legitimate heir. I can't say that I want them to kiss each other, but this is such an interesting pairing, and the actors have great chemistry. They do kind of match each other's freak, even if it's just in a sibling way. Helaena is really the only person who can put Aemond in his place and is unafraid to do so. She tells him that he isn't shit, and I love it.
Aegon will be king again. And you. You'll be dead.
Helena's feelings about Aemond, or anyone really, are hard to gauge. With her magical seer powers added onto pre-existing neurodiversity, she doesn't express affection in traditional ways. She certainly doesn't approve of his mass murder and the whole burning their brother, who was also her husband, situation, but she seems perfectly happy, if a bit confused, to see him before he ruins the vibe. But this episode has a very valid reading that Aemond may have extra Targaryen feelings for Helaena, and Aemond having a crush on his mother and also his sister is very funny to me, so I'm gonna believe it. He clearly feels bad for hurting her, and this is the most vulnerable we have seen him since he was a child. Even when he was with Sylvie, he was still guarded and emotionally distant, but here he quakes and tears up. We know that Aemond has always wanted to marry Helaena, not necessarily because of feelings for her, but because he sees it as a way to secure his own power as the Targaryen king he strives to be.
We'll strengthen the family, keep our Valyrian blood pure.
Much like the third family member Aemond has a crush on, he cares about Targaryen legacy and traditions. I think he sees Helaena as another thing he was deprived of by virtue of being the second son. The actors and the director of this episode have spoken about these characters having a special connection. Also, the location of their meeting is the exit to the secret passageway that leads out into the city. My guess is that they were just reusing a set because they wanted to have a scene on a balcony of some sort to create tension that he might push her off, but this does technically indicate that they have a secret meeting place where he knows he will find her, so have fun with that, you little freaks. Helaena has clearly leveled up here in terms of her seer powers. She has become a walking spoiler alert, and she now has full HD replay of Aemond's attempted fratricide. My intuition is that her powers became stronger after Jaehaerys' death, that the horror somehow unmoored her in time and allowed her to see with more clarity, but I wish that we had maybe gotten some explanation from the show. And Helena's powers go beyond mere prediction to some sort of astral projection. Helaena is seemingly able to latch onto Daemon's Weirwood vision. Visually, I thought that this was slightly off-putting because it is a completely different visual language from anything else on the show. She's basically in the void from Stranger Things, but it was still very cool, and there are so many interesting implications about the connections between dragon magic and green seer old gods magic. I also love how it was framed the exact same way as her appearing behind Aemond at the end of episode 5. I really want to know if Helaena and Alice are aware of each other or if they chat over the Weirwood net. I really want them to be friends. I think they would vibe. Alice seems firmly rooted in Greenseer Old Gods Weirwood magic, but she could have access to other forms of magic. There is so much we do not know about her and the nature of magic in this world. It is possible that the two forms of magic are connected. The dragon dreams we hear Targaryens describe in the Dunk and Egg novellas are functionally the same as the green dreams Jojen Reed has in the main series. And George R.R. Martin has said that in this world, magic is tied to dragons, and that more dragons means more magic of all kinds. So it makes sense that Helaena would be a more powerful seer than any Targaryen in the future. Speaking of future Targaryens, the man we see briefly in Daemon's vision is Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven, who will not be born for a few decades, but eventually becomes the three-eyed raven who helps Bran explore his greenseer powers in the main series. Brynden was one of the bastard children Aegon IV legitimized on his deathbed, and his mother was Melissa Blackwood, so he is a relative of both Daemon and Willem Blackwood, whose blood sacrifice potentially enabled this vision. In the books, Bloodraven has only one eye, but they didn't do that here, probably because they didn't want viewers to confuse him with Aemond. Bloodraven was said to have 1,000 eyes in one, which is loosely true because of his abilities as a skin changer and greenseer. And because he was half Targaryen, he could have been a dragon dreamer as well as a greenseer. In this episode, they casually mentioned that Helaena doesn't like to fly, and I'm guessing that is just a reason to not show Dreamfyre for financial reasons. Dreamfyre is a very old dragon, and Helaena must have claimed her when she was a child, since we saw her flying away from the funeral on Driftmark. There's just no way that a child would risk their life to claim a dragon and then have zero relationship or interest in that dragon. It's frustrating that this show is exploring the dreamer aspect of Dragon Dreamer, but not the dragon. There are so many interesting things they could do with the Helaena Dreamfyre connection to expand the lore and what it means to have a dragon. I have seen people theorizing that Helaena doesn't like to fly because touching Dreamfyre amplifies her powers and causes intense visions, and that's a really cool idea. I understand that dragons are expensive and that creating a whole new dragon model is a lot of work, and I understand that this season faced intense budget cuts, so I don't really blame the creators for this, but I think that Helena's arc has and will continue to suffer by not exploring her relationship with Dreamfyre. Once again, fuck you, David Zaslav. And Dreamfyre actually lived at Harrenhal for several years at the end of her previous writer Rhaenyra's life, which is a really cool connection. Hell, it's even possible that Alice met Dreamfyre if she really has been there for hundreds of years. Did she feed Dreamfyre weirwood paste? Did she have trippy dreams? I really also want to know if Caraxes was having weird dreams at Harrenhal. If I could retroactively make sure that they got the dragon budget, I think it could have been really amazing to see Jaehaerys' funeral at the Dragon Pit with Dreamfyre lighting the pyre. It wouldn't even need to be that expensive, you could just have her head emerging from the shadow, and that would tie the change in her abilities with her son's death and her relationship with Dreamfyre. Dragon action isn't everything. The relationships these characters have with their dragons are also so important. Once again, this is something that I blame HBO for, not the writers. You can't adapt a show called House of the Dragon if you aren't willing to shell out the money for the titular dragons. My main issue coming out of this episode was Daemon's vision. And I think I like it better now that I've had some time to think about it, but it really depends on where they go from here. And I do think it would have been stronger character-wise if all of Daemon's ghost therapy had been what convinced him to fully support Rhaenyra. They could have had him find out about the prophecy after that if they wanted to go in that direction. I was fine with the Song of Ice and Fire prophecy being used in an abstract sense as a plot device, but actually showing those events on screen makes it concrete in a way I'm not a fan of. Also, that White Walker just looked dumb. It really threw me out of the episode. There is the obvious reminding us all of the awful ending of Game of Thrones and the fact that the prophecy doesn't really actually play out in the show unless Arya is somehow a secret Targaryen. But beyond that, if this prophecy takes on too much weight in the narrative, it will prevent this show from being its own story. It's one thing to use the prophecy as a narrative propellant, and another to reframe this story as just the prelude to another story. Once again, it really depends on how this plays out going forward. I think I tentatively like it as a conclusion to Daemon's season-long arc. And I don't think it's necessarily taking a shortcut with the character, because Daemon needed all of his trippy visions to get to a place where he would be open to the idea of prophecy. Alice Rivers says as much herself.
All your life you've sought to command your own fate, but today you are ready.
I do love that she's just sitting on his bed, and he's like, oh, what, this again? Which implies that that's just something she does. It is also worth noting that Daemon only sees a few select images, not the whole picture. Daemon sees Rhaenyra on the throne, but he doesn't see anything else about her reign. He sees dead dragons, but he doesn't know who killed them. We do not know what precisely he thinks is going to happen and what his role will be. Prophecies in this world are always true, but they can be misleading, and their interpretation is shaped by what people want to believe. This is just a step on Daemon's series-long arc. What's going to happen when the war doesn't go as he thinks it should, or he sees that Rhaenyra is becoming someone different? Will he remain dedicated, or will he question this newfound faith? And Daemon's newfound faith in the prophecy parallels and reinforces Rhaenyra's own journey. I have loved the way this season has used the prophecy to further Rhaenyra's arc towards fanaticism and believing that she is ordained by the gods, especially with the dramatic irony that we know that Rhaenyra isn't actually the chosen one. She isn't going to save the world, and it will be fascinating to see what happens when her faith in her own righteousness is tested. Daemon and Aemond both confront their fates in this episode. They are both destined to die, swallowed up by the God's Eye, and now they both know it. Directly revealing major spoilers is a bold choice, to be sure, but there are some very interesting things that they could do with this. I have really enjoyed the way that they have paralleled Daemon and Aemond's stories this season. I love my two silver-haired psychopaths. I love when one character is another character's shadow. And this will be another interesting way to parallel and mirror these two stories going forward. Daemon seems to have embraced his fate, where Aemond wants to fight against it. There are a couple instances of characters knowing their own deaths in the main series. There is a prophecy that a child, Cersei Lannister, hears from a witch called Maggie the Frog. She is told that she will die strangled by the vhagar, which means younger brother. Cersei thinks that the vhagar is Tyrion, and the desire to escape his fate feeds her desire to capture and kill him after his escape. But it is very likely that she has misinterpreted, and that it will actually be Jaime who kills her, as he is the younger twin. We also have Jojen Reed, who is a green dreamer and has seen many things, including his own death. He makes it clear that the things he sees in his dreams cannot be changed, and they do all come to pass. The question that prophecy poses is one of free will. If your destiny is set, do your choices matter? Are they even your choices if you are always destined to make them? George R. R. Martin's world is one where a person's choices absolutely do matter and shape their destiny. But any universe where prophecy exists has to be at least somewhat deterministic. So how do you square that circle? After hearing the vhagar prophecy, Cersei kills the friend who accompanied her to see the witch, thinking that if no one else knows about the prophecy, it might not come true. This obviously isn't gonna work, and it's similar to Aemond threatening to kill Helaena and her replying that it wouldn't change anything. Now, is Helaena saying that specifically Aemond killing her wouldn't change anything, or is she saying that nothing he does can change his fate? I would assume the latter. She says it as if it is something inevitable. But just because you can't change your own fate doesn't mean that what you do in the time you have left doesn't matter. If anything, it matters more. Jojen Reed's knowledge of his own death empowers him in some ways. He is unafraid to approach the Stark direwolves because he knows that it is not the day he dies. In this episode, Helaena tells Daemon,
"It's all a story, and you're but one part in it. You know your part."
And in episode 6, Alice told him,
"You are not the player, but a piece on the board."
These statements could imply a lack of agency, or they could be a reminder that he is a part of something far greater than himself. If you play into set destinies too much, it will rob characters of their agency. This may be intended as a meta-commentary on the creation of history, as this is a prequel based on a history book. Ultimately, that is what these characters become, just pieces of a story remembered through the fog of history. Alright, that's enough with the preamble. Let's get to the main subject of this review. And I know that this will be shocking to people who have watched my other videos, but I have a lot to say about Alicent Hightower. It is not my fault that the internet keeps finding new ways to be wrong about her. In this episode, we get the season's second reunion between Rhaenyra and Alicent. Now, I loved the scene itself. It's the quiet inverse of their confrontation in Driftmark in the first season. This time, it's Rhaenyra who thinks herself the righteous one and believes Alicent wishes to do as she pleases without making sacrifices.
What have I done but what was expected of me? Forever upholding the kingdom, the family, the law. Will you flout it all to do as you please?
Alicent, let her go!
Where is duty? Where is sacrifice? It's trampled under your pretty foot again.
Still, you imagine you can have all you want without paying too high a price. A price I had no choice but to pay.
Rhaenyra has developed her faith where Alicent has lost hers. Now it is Rhaenyra who is bound by duty. Alicent demanded an eye for an eye, and now Rhaenyra demands a son for a son. It's beautiful. But as I know many people have pointed out, the circumstances and logistics of this make no sense. Is the Velaryon blockade actually real, or was it the friends we made along the way? Are we to believe that Maester Orwyle has some sort of really cool backstory where he was a smuggler? The circumstances of the episode 3 Sept reunion scene worked better for me because it was so operatic and absurd that it almost made sense. I love when this show is a soap opera. I love hijinks and shenanigans. I love dressing up as a nun to sneak into a church to threaten your ex-girlfriend at knife point. But when you lose the theatrical elements, it just kind of feels absurd in a bad way. And I don't know how much the logistics of what Alicent is proposing here make sense. Where would she and Helaena and Jaehaera go? And obviously, this would not end the war on its own. Alicent has to know that Aemond will never surrender, but she believes she can protect Helaena and keep her out of the fight. I do think that the broad strokes of it make sense. Rhaenyra now has the dragon power to take down Vhagar and the troop advantage to win the war. She will take King's Landing by force if she has to. Alicent thinks that she can spare the city of King's Landing a brutal siege or dragon attack and make sure that she and her daughter and granddaughter won't be held prisoner for the rest of their lives. Now, to go a little conspiracy-brained, I think that this scene may have been added or just moved here because they needed to manufacture an ending at this point in the story. This is basically where they had to end the season because they didn't have the budget for another big dragon battle. But it isn't a natural ending point in the story. Maybe they would have done this anyway, even if they had 10 episodes, but they did have to create something here to make this season feel more conclusive. Without any specific spoilers, there will be a time very soon when a scene similar to this could happen that would make more logistical sense, and it's possible that this scene or a scene like it was originally meant to happen then. Because they are forcing these two characters together kind of unnaturally for a second time this season. And I understand for television purposes why you would want your two leads with amazing chemistry, whose relationship is the emotional core of the show, to have scenes together. I love watching Emma Darcy and Olivia Cooke together. It is one of the best parts of the show. But ultimately, the plot had to bend around them, which created awkward shapes. And as I've said before, I do think that these reunion scenes were very important for the character arcs of both Alicent and Rhaenyra, but they did feel a bit frustrating because neither of them could be a full and honest airing of grievances. Whatever feelings they have for each other, so much has come between them over the years that still needs to be addressed, but I do think it will be next season. Before I get into the Alicent character analysis, I'm just going to address the elephant in the room, the question that was on my mind, even if it wasn't on the show's mind. What about Darren? Won't someone please think about Darren? Now, I think that the reason they didn't bring up Darren was just because they wanted to focus on the personal dynamics rather than the political. So what would happen to Darren if Rhaenyra takes King's Landing and puts an end to the Green armies? Because I do think there is a path where Darren could live. He could never marry, he would probably have to be separated from his dragon Tessarion, But as long as Rhaenyra has overwhelmingly more dragon power, Daeron won't be able to challenge her and she can spare his life. It would arguably be in Rhaenyra's political interests to spare him, to demonstrate mercy and judiciousness by only killing the brothers who were involved in the coup and raised arms against her. Remember, at this point, Alicent believes that with her new dragons and the Riverlander troops, Rhaenyra will very likely win the war, and even if the Greens prevail, it could be at the cost of Helaena or Daeron or Gwaine or countless others. And as dangerous as it is to surrender to Rhaenyra, Daeron will also be in serious danger if the war continues. His dragon is the smallest. If he goes into battle against Rhaenyra's dragons, he could meet the same fate as Aegon. Surrendering gives Alicent a better opportunity to negotiate for Daeron to be spared, especially because he hasn't yet gone into battle against Rhaenyra's forces. She has no real excuse to execute him. Really, the dragon seeds are going to be a much bigger problem for her. And I've seen so many people saying that Alicent doomed Gwaine and Criston by giving away their location, but all she said is that they were in the Riverlands, which is a huge area and also the most likely place for them to be. This actually may have temporarily saved Gwaine and Criston because Daemon was planning on marching his massive army south from Harrenhal to take King's Landing. And Criston's troops were on their way to Harrenhal from King's Landing, they would have met and been obliterated. Now obviously, if Rhaenyra wins and takes power, Criston, Otto, and maybe even Gwaine will likely be executed as traitors if they are caught. Alicent is betraying them here, but continuing the war isn't safe for them either. I have seen so many people calling Alicent's actions in this episode character assassination. And look, you don't have to like Alicent or agree with her decision, but what she does in this episode is not inconsistent or out of character. It's what her arc has been building to all season. Alicent Hightower was and still is my favorite character on this show because she is the embodiment of the human heart in conflict with itself. Alicent has always been a writhing mass of neuroses and internal conflict. Alicent has been reckoning with her decision to help crown Aegon all season. She has slowly realized that many of the people in the system she felt a duty to are rotten to the core. But Alicent supported Aegon and she tried to protect him and she stood in front of a dragon. Yes, she did. And then everything went to shit. Alicent chose to help the Greens steal the throne at the end of last season for 4 main reasons as far as I see it. Number 1, she thought that it would be the safest option for Aegon and her other children for the reasons outlined by Otto in Season 1.
The realm will not accept her, and to secure her claim, she'll have to put your children to the sword. She'll have no choice.
And while some of this is a self-fulfilling prophecy, there was real danger for Alicent's sons. Even if Rhaenyra bore no desire to kill her brothers, they, and any sons they might have, are still threats to her claim, and who's to say one of her allies wouldn't try to hurt them? After all, her closest ally is Daemon. Number 2, Alicent thought that Aegon would be manageable, that she and her father would maintain their de facto rule over the 7 kingdoms. Crowning Aegon was a way to maintain her own power. Alicent is not power-hungry by nature. In this episode, we see the opposite. She doesn't ask for a place on Rhaenyra's council. She wants to be free. But that doesn't mean that power is an easy thing to let go of, especially if you think that yours are the most responsible hands. As her father said in the very first episode,
"The gods have yet to make a man who lacks the patience for absolute power, Your Grace."
Number 3, Alicent saw that she couldn't stop the coup. It would have happened regardless. But she could control how it happened, and she could save Rhaenyra by getting Aegon to send terms instead of swords. She thought that with Rhaenys captive and her dragon off the board, they would have an advantage on Rhaenyra and could likely get her to accept terms, and it would be possible to avoid a war. Rhaenys escaping with Meleys kinda ruined this one. And number 4, she really did believe that Viserys had changed his mind, and she was doing her duty by fulfilling his wishes. And none of this was stupid or paranoid. She had very good reasons for believing all of this. But it doesn't mean that what she did was right. It helped lead to a war. Alicent's arc this season has been about reevaluating these reasons and her commitment to duty in general. She wanted to keep her children safe, but they are in more danger now than ever. She stood in front of a dragon to protect Aegon, but that didn't keep him safe from his own brother. Aegon was not as easy to control as she thought, and Alicent knows nothing of his recovery. As far as she knows, he will be indefinitely incapacitated, and it will be Aemond in power, and he is even more maniacal and difficult to control. She has been stripped of her political power and her seat on the council, and she finds out that she was mistaken about Viserys changing his mind. Now, I don't really like how much weight the show has put on Viserys' wishes here. It seems like they're trying to retcon that was the only reason Alicent went along with the coup, but I don't think that's so. If you go back to episode 9 of season 1, she is smiling when she tells Otto that Viserys changed his mind.
He told me he wished for Aegon to be king.
Now, Alicent wasn't lying when she said that Rhaenyra would make a good queen in episode 8 in the first season. She was ready to accept her. Had Alicent not believed Viserys changed his mind, and had Otto not already planned a coup, she would not have challenged Rhaenyra and they might have reconciled. Alicent has always been conflicted about wanting Aegon on the throne. In the beginning, she only wanted to support Rhaenyra, but circumstances got in the way of that. In her conversation with Otto in episode 3 of season 1, she admits that she would like to see her son on the throne, but she doesn't wish to take it from Rhaenyra.
Do you not want your son to be king?
What mother wouldn't? What of my son? Would you have me raise a man to steal his own sister's birthright?
She advocates for Rhaenyra to Viserys in episode 4. She's being a little judgy when she confronts Rhaenyra in the Godswood.
Continue. In a brothel.
But she's also legitimately concerned for her friend because being seen in a brothel with her uncle really could destroy Rhaenyra's reputation and threaten her claim.
If that lord were to think that you were being sullied, it would ruin everything.
And there was always the part of Alicent that did want Aegon on the throne, even when she didn't want to betray Rhaenyra and she knew that he was wrong for it. And I think that this still works even when you acknowledge that. Alicent has a pattern of using Viserys' wishes to mask her own.
My husband would have desired this mercy be shown to his daughter.
Your husband? Or you, his daughter's childhood companion?
Believing that Viserys changed his mind resolved this. It let her believe that she was still doing her duty, that she wasn't betraying Rhaenyra. One thing that has frustrated me about this season in the show is the way that it seems to see Viserys through rose-colored glasses. Now, I think it makes perfect sense that the characters would think of him fondly. I just wish it didn't feel like the show unironically sees him that way.
Perhaps those who strive for it are the least suited to wear it.
Don't lecture me!
Viserys never wanted it himself, if you recall. It came to him, and he did his best. It's not a prize to be won, but a burden to bear.
It can sometimes seem like they are presenting the fact that Viserys wanted Rhaenyra on the throne as a moral justification and not just a legal one, without interrogating why the wishes of one incredibly flawed man should matter. Contrary to popular belief, Alicent still loves her sons, even Aemond probably. Alicent's relationships with her two eldest sons are some of the most fascinating dynamics on the show to me, and I really wish we'd seen more of them together. Generational trauma is at the core of this show, and Alicent has thoroughly replicated her own trauma in her children. Alicent has always had a complicated relationship with her kids, especially Aegon. They were conceived via marital rape when she was a teenager. They represent the rift between her and Rhaenyra and everything she lost. They are the rift. They are vessels for her own self-hatred, Aegon most of all, and I think that's why he has borne the brunt of Alicent's abuse. He bears the weight of all her expectations and fears. She feels she needs to preserve his claim, and yet he repeatedly shows himself unworthy of it. Alicent loves her son, but she also can't help but resent him, and she hates herself for what she does to protect him. It is utterly pathetic that Aegon whines about trying so hard but never being good enough in response to Alicent's chastisement for raping Diana, but you can understand why he feels that way. Aegon faced impossible expectations. Nothing he could do would ever make up for the way he tore his mother's life apart by simply being born. And he could never find the favor of his father simply by virtue of who his mother was, or rather, who she was not. He was born for purely political reasons, and then he was set up to fail. Perhaps that's part of why he turned to hedonism, because what's the purpose of trying if you will never succeed? And I think Alicent believed that even if Aegon was a flop, at least Aemond was dutiful and responsible. But her image of her second son began to completely fall apart after he returned from Storm's End, having murdered Luke. Having seen the full season now, I feel even more strongly that not showing Aemond's return to the Red Keep after Storm's End was a huge mistake. The fallout of this incident was crucial to both Alicent and Aemond's arcs this season. That is the point when Alicent's downward spiral would have begun. It destroyed her hopes of peace, her confidence that she was doing the right thing. I think this is part of the reason some people think that Alicent feels like a different character in Season 2. It's because we didn't see the thing that made her begin to unravel. I would imagine that her affair with Criston started shortly after that. And she had to blame herself to a degree. She knows her actions contributed to Aemond's resentment and desire for violent retribution against Lucerys.
I want you to put out your eye. I plan to make a gift of it to my mother.
I think that's part of why she was so outwardly spiteful towards him, and why she tried to make excuses for him as well.
Rhaenyra's son took his eye and was never punished for it. What he did, however vicious.
The caprice of youth.
In many ways, Alicent and Aemond are so similar. Both grew up with a strong adherence to duty. I believe in a twisted way, Aemond thinks that he was doing his duty in burning Aegon. Obviously, it was also personal, but he thought that Aegon was a weak leader who was endangering their cause. Alicent and Aemond have been paralleled a few times this season. Aemond demands Helaena fly to war, just as Alicent demanded Helaena participate in the procession in episode 2.
I do not wish to fight.
Our wishes must take second place now to what is necessary to preserve the throne.
Why?
We are representatives of the throne. We have a duty.
Obviously, they both approach this with different energies, but both were driven by a belief in a duty to the cause, regardless of personal emotions. In the first episode of the season, Alicent and Aemond each call each other angry.
Aemond is angry.
And Alicent is simply angry.
And in this episode, they each beg a beautiful daughter of Viserys Targaryen to run away with them.
Come with me.
Come with me.
Alicent believes that her two eldest sons are beyond saving. Aegon is physically broken and Aemond is mentally broken. He just murdered thousands of people. But she can still save her daughter. Alicent's red line is Helaena. When Aemond tries to violently force her to war, Alicent displays a ferocity we ironically haven't seen since she defended him back on Driftmark after he lost his eye. This scene spells out Alicent's motivations incredibly clearly.
Would you not have us prevail?
Not like this. Not like this!
Her daughter's safety and sanity is too high a price to pay. She immediately goes to Orwyle to seek passage to Dragonstone. And ultimately, I would also sell out the world to protect Helaena. I think that's actually very cool of her. From the very start of the show, Alicent Hightower has been defined by her adherence to duty. Alicent clung to her duty and her sense of righteousness because it was what she had in a world where she could not control her own life or what happened to her body. But that duty has only led to misery and destruction. It makes sense that she would start to question it. Alicent thought that she was doing her duty in forcing Aegon to take the throne, just as her father thought that it was his duty to make his daughter queen. Otto taught Alicent to see herself and her children as political entities first and people second. and she saw her unhappiness in her marriage and motherhood as part of that duty.
Sadness is a condition of motherhood.
In her conversation with Helaena in this episode, Alicent says that unhappy people look for something to hate. She directed her anger and resentment at Rhaenyra because she was the easiest person to blame. To direct it towards Viserys or Otto would mean to question her duty and acknowledge the ways that she was exploited by the men around her. And it's a sunk cost fallacy. She couldn't accept that her suffering could be meaningless, that the system she dedicated her life to was rotten to the core. Alicent snapped on Driftmark in the first season. She lost her cool and her composure, and she surrendered to the fury that had been brewing inside her for so long. And she was angry and upset because her son lost an eye, but her outburst was primarily about Rhaenyra and her pretty feet stepping over consequences once more. It wasn't really about Aemond losing an eye to Luke, it was about Rhaenyra taking something from her.
I shall have one of her son's eyes in return.
And she deeply regretted it immediately after. She was not proud of what she did there. But after her outburst, her father accepted her as an ally in the game and reaffirmed her need to win it.
It was an ugly thing, I regret it.
We play an ugly game. And now, for the first time, I see that you have the determination to win it.
After the incident, she doubled down on her outward piety as well as her moral corruption. She consolidated her power. She went ahead with the marriage of Aegon and Helaena. She accepted Larys's dubious methods. She became more morally compromised than ever, and she also doubled down on her self-hatred. I think it's fair to label Alicent a hypocrite, but I've stopped using that term to describe her because I think it misses something as well. Self-righteousness often comes from a deep well of self-loathing and insecurity. Alicent has clung to her cloak of righteousness as a means of protection, but she is racked with guilt. She spends the season reflecting on her own sins. And she continues to double down on duty, thinking that it will fix things somehow. She makes Helaena parade herself through the streets with her son's beheaded corpse because that is what is expected. In this episode, Alicent tells Helaena that she was happier before she was queen, which must cut her to her core because she realizes that she has replicated her own sadness in her daughter. That's when Alicent asks Helaena if she would want to leave. Sacrificing her children's happiness and her own to duty in the name of service to the realm has only brought misery, and it hasn't helped the realm either. In this episode, Rhaenyra claims that Alicent is unwilling to make sacrifices, and I've seen this get a fair amount of criticism. People rightly point out that Alicent has sacrificed for her duty. That was basically her whole character in Season 1. But I don't think that the show is trying to deny that. In this same scene, Alicent talks about how she gave up herself for her duty. And Rhaenyra is being cruel in this scene. She is projecting. I don't think we're meant to see her as morally right or take what she says at face value. But what Rhaenyra is saying here is true in a way, just not in the way she knows. In episode 9 of the first season, Otto says that sending assassins to kill Rhaenyra and her family is a necessary sacrifice, and Alicent objects.
It is unsavory, yes, but a sacrifice we must make to secure Aegon's succession.
That was a major part of her drive to find Aegon first in that episode so she could convince him to spare Rhaenyra. Part of the reason this war is happening is because Alicent couldn't sacrifice Rhaenyra. Rhaenyra knows nothing of this, which is a tragic irony of this scene. She bemoans Alicent's refusal to choose, not knowing that it saved her life. Rhaenyra is right that at this point she does have to take Aegon's head if she wants to secure her claim to the throne. When she says, "a son for a son," she is being vindictive, but that is a political truth. This story is first and foremost a tragedy, and a key aspect of tragedies is self-fulfilling prophecy. While Alicent's children would have been in danger regardless as rival claimants, Rhaenyra was never going to just order their execution to advance her own power the way Otto suggested. And this whole thing is still ultimately Viserys' fault. He created a powder keg that likely would have exploded at some point. Otto and Alicent's actions had understandable motives, but they still made conflict a near certainty. They did sow seeds, and they can't be absolved of their part in starting the war. Alicent and her father helped create the circumstances in which it did become inevitable that Rhaenyra would have to execute Aegon to take the throne. And because I have seen so many people claiming that Alicent is just casually giving over her son, no, this is clearly an agonizing decision for her. This kills something inside of her. And I have also seen criticism of the fact that Alicent doesn't really push back here, but in this moment I think Alicent is feeling too much to speak. She's angry, she's anguished, but she is resolute to do what she came to do. Part of her knew the whole time that her son would be the price. It was a sacrifice she had prepared for. And it's easy for Alicent at this point to feel she needs to atone and see herself in the wrong here, because in many ways she was. But this is not the end of her journey as a character. I do not think this means that she's going to be entirely subservient and deferential to Rhaenyra going forward. So I think it's safe to say that the queer subtext in Alicent and Rhaenyra's relationship is closer to becoming text in this episode. I don't know that this relationship will ever be explicitly romantic, and I don't think it needs to be. I mean, I would like to see them make out for educational purposes, but their connection is crucial to the story nonetheless. The channel Banned from Theaters did an excellent video on this relationship and subtext and why a relationship doesn't need to be explicitly romantic or physically consummated to be canon. YouTube isn't letting me post links right now, but you can search the title. It's excellent. I highly recommend watching it. They lay it out much better than I could, but this show makes a lot more sense when you look at it through the frame of a doomed romance. The relationship between these two has underlined the story from the beginning, like literally the first scene.
That's almost large enough to settle too. I believe I'm quite content as a spectator. Thank you.
But why can't they follow the books? Because they're not. This is not a faithful adaptation, and it doesn't have to be. Telling a story in a fake history book and telling it as a TV show are two entirely different animals. The show needed to create an emotional core for the story, and Rhaenyra and Alicent's relationship is a great one. George R. R. Martin may not be happy with where the show is now, and he has a right to feel however he feels, but he did take credit for helping to create the show and giving it its shape. He signed on to aging down Alicent and changing her relationship with Rhaenyra and making that the emotional axis of the show, and this was always going to have ripple effects. If he wanted a book-accurate adaptation, he should have demanded one from the start. And the tragedy of this change, why I think it works so well, is that it doesn't change anything. The outcome will still be the same because this war was always bigger than the two of them. I have seen people asking how Alicent could immediately ask Rhaenyra to run away with her when Rhaenyra has just demanded her son's head. But this is not a rational moment. It undermines the whole reason she came to Dragonstone if Rhaenyra doesn't take the throne. Alicent knows it's impossible and irresponsible, and that it will never happen. Agreeing to give up Aegon is excruciating for her, but it's also a massive burden that is lifted. She is at last herself, and the truest thing, the thing she wants more than anything, is to have her friend back and be far away from the burden of duty. It's what Rhaenyra asked her to do in the very first episode.
I want to fly with you on Dragonback, see the great wonders across the narrow sea and eat only cake.
It's a desperate desire to return to that beautiful distant dream before everything went so wrong. And yes, this was all so long ago and so much else has happened, but I think that's part of it. It's the last thing she ever wanted with her whole heart before she had to give up the Lady Alicent to become the queen.
I like to believe I'm still the Lady Alicent, but all anyone sees when they look at me now is the queen.
I love that both women are wearing blue in this scene. Blue is the color of their mother's houses of Florent and Arryn, and Alicent wore blue back in the very first episode. It symbolizes her return to herself. Alicent doesn't want politicking or power. She wants to live a simple life, to die unnoticed and unremarked. It sounds like she does want to return to more domestic pursuits, so I guess that Aemond was right and all of you feminazis owe him an apology.
She holds love for our enemy.
So I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of people really hate Alicent Hightower and blame her for starting the Dance of the Dragons. And having Alicent come and turn cloak to Rhaenyra and submit to her demands definitely plays into that. It also plays into the idea that Rhaenyra's side is the right one. I've seen plenty of intelligent and empathetic and insightful people whose opinions I otherwise respect be like, Rhaenyra never acted like she wanted her brothers dead, so Alicent's just a dumb delusional bitch for thinking her children are in danger, and she's making her sons paranoid out of spite. The show's creators have said that this isn't a good guys, bad guys story, but clearly most people don't see it that way. A significant portion of the audience misunderstands the fundamental conflict and thinks that the Green Coup was a fully villainous pure power grab. But from the Watsonian perspective, there is a valid question of whether a king's chosen successor should override established tradition. Yes, male primogeniture is dumb, but this whole thing is dumb. The idea of a rightful claimant to the throne is dumb. Rhaenyra's claim isn't actually based in gender equity, it's based on Viserys' wishes. This conflict fundamentally boils down to I am the eldest boy versus because dad said so. To many in the realm, Aegon and his children, or really any male descendants of Aegon, Aemond, or Daeron, would always have a superior claim to Rhaenyra and her descendants. The rules can be bent to the personal and political interests of the powerful, and power is a slippery thing. So, could this war have been prevented if Alicent and Rhaenyra remained friends? The show certainly seems to frame it as such, but I don't know that it really could have. Alicent could have actively advocated for her sons and Rhaenyra's to get along, they could have married Jace and Helaena, and that could have prevented the war we see on this show, but conflict would be near inevitable at some point in the future. This creates two rival branches of House Targaryen, regardless of whether Rhaenyra and Alicent get along. Now, I don't necessarily mind the show treating their rift as the root cause for dramatic reasons. It's far more tragic if this could have been prevented, but it does place more of the burden for the war on Alicent and Rhaenyra, especially Alicent as she is the one who we see actively going against Rhaenyra. Now, when you take a step back and see things from her perspective, she has understandable reasons for doing the things she does. But she is consistently presented as the one who is the problem, the one who lashes out and becomes hostile, the one who is in the wrong. It was always inevitable that most of the audience would be Team Black, as Rhaenyra's claim conforms more to modern ideals of gender equity, and making Aegon an openly despicable person didn't help either. The show does have to engage with modern morality on some level because it is made for a modern audience, but is the show really trying to say that Team Black are the good guys? The show undeniably frames Rhaenyra as its primary protagonist, and thus the Greens will inevitably be seen as villains because they oppose her. Also, their key players are a homophobic lesbian, the Kris Jenner of Westeros, a rapist, an unhinged knight who keeps rage murdering people, and a literal cartoon supervillain. To be fair, on Team Black we have spoiled princess, niece groomer, deadbeat dad, mass murderer, and daddy issues, but actually those are all Daemontargaryen. So does the show think that Rhaenyra is the rightful claimant? Probably. And I would agree that she probably is in terms of the law, since the Lords of the Realm swore oaths to her. But that doesn't mean the show necessarily thinks that she is the good guy or that she deserves to rule. Now, I think that the first season does kind of paint Rhaenyra as the right choice. In the season finale, they have Rhaenys decide to support Rhaenyra because she admires her restraint, explicitly framing her as someone who would make a good ruler. They also repeatedly show us how much Aegon sucks. The show's heraldry also frames the Blacks as the rightful side. In the book, Rhaenyra and Aegon both change their banners. Aegon keeps the black ground, but changes the three-headed dragon sigil from red to gold in honor of his beautiful golden boy Sunfyre. Rhaenyra quarters the Targaryen sigil with Velaryon and Arryn crests, and honestly, it looks like shit. The vibes are trash. This sigil sucks. But the show has Rhaenyra maintain the traditional Targaryen red and black heraldry, while Aegon adopts a green and gold color scheme. This was almost certainly done for readability and aesthetics, but it explicitly paints the Greens as usurpers and imposters. And to be fair, they did do a coup. Rhaenyra has seen signifiers of her divine right, the White Hart, Adam claiming sea smoke and bending the knee, Vermithor submitting to her. And Daemon's arc this season also brings him to view Rhaenyra as the chosen one, the one who deserves to rule. Making Rhaenyra the unquestionably rightful and righteous candidate would undermine the premise of a story with no good guys or bad guys. But I don't think that's what the show is actually doing. I think that this is done to further Rhaenyra's belief in the righteousness of her claim, not because the show is picking a side. I do think that they want the audience to root for Rhaenyra to an extent, but that isn't the same thing as the show being Team Black. It might make social media hell, but I do kind of love the way that this show has so many fans behaving fully like medieval peasants and screaming about how Alicent should have been executed for assaulting the heir to the throne. It's easy to understand why Rhaenyra feels wronged and why she thinks she deserves to rule, and I think that's the point. One of the most common criticisms I see of this show is that it is gender essentialist. Women are virtuous peacemakers and men are violent warmongers. And I think that this is fair in some ways. There are only 3 main female characters with any political agency, and they are the 3 voices most against the war. In the book, Rhaenys is the first to suggest sending the dragons into battle, but the show has her preach restraint. And it's not completely binary. Viserys was not a warmonger. His moniker is Viserys the Peaceful.
Our beloved king, Viserys the Peaceful.
His legacy is a huge reason Rhaenyra and Alicent both wish to prevent war. Hugh looks pretty horrified when asked to burn innocents. Otto isn't a pacifist, but he wants to prevent all-out war if possible. Even cristoncole preaches some restraint when it comes to using dragons in battle. Mysaria is totally down to kill Alicent and encourages Rhaenyra to use her dragons. Baela would have absolutely crispy fried Cole if she wasn't under orders. Rhaenys may preach caution, but she also murdered hundreds of people as a bit. Rhaenyra burned dozens of people with a dragon. And much of this show is an exploration of the strictures of the society these characters live in. Westeros is a society where men and boys are raised to revere violence. It is a society that values martial and masculine power.
This is the stuff, Lino.
In the faith of the Seven, the warrior is male. People pray to the mother for peace. It's undeniable that war is gendered, both in this world and ours. The vast majority of wars are fought by men at the behest of men. And this is a story about a woman who was usurped due to her gender that sets out to deconstruct patriarchy, and it's right to explore this, but it can also be very heavy-handed.
Yes, but the Dowager Queen is a woman.
It is merely that the gentler sex, heretofore, has not been much privy to the strategies of battle.
And the show does often present a woman-peaceful, men-violent dichotomy that can be frustrating and limiting.
It is not her, but the men around her who seek bloodshed.
We knew, even then, that men trained up for battle are eager to fight.
Now, I think that part of the reason the show has Rhaenyra and Alicent both try to prevent war is to up the tragedy of it all. I don't think it's necessarily motivated by a desire to soften these characters, but it still plays into some very shallow gender politics. This show doesn't have the scheming, conniving Cersei Lannister-esque figure that many expected Alicent to be. Although both Alicent and Rhaenyra have Cersei parallels, neither is blatantly sociopathic. And I love Cersei Lannister as much as the next dysfunctional bisexual, but this show's female characters not being on her level doesn't mean that the show is trying to present them as righteous and good. I love Alicent Hightower and I will defend her always, but she's not a good person. She's tremendously flawed and has done so much damage to her children. She sells out the son she forced onto the throne to be executed for that crime. No matter her reasons or circumstances, that's morally not great. And she's forgiven for everything by me personally, but so many people absolutely despise her. It's hard to say that the show is trying to frame her as good. Yes, show Alicent is different from her book depiction. That is the central conceit of the show. They changed Alicent's age and her relationship with Rhaenyra. They changed her characterization to revolve around duty to make her rebellious Rhaenyra's narrative foil. And show Alicent is an incredible character who works better for the story that the show is trying to tell. Frankly, I don't care that she doesn't want to bathe in blood. I'm sure there is a more book-accurate version of the character that would have been amazing, but at a certain point, evaluating something for what it isn't is a counterproductive way to approach media. And in my opinion, Alicent and Rhaenyra simply hating each other and trying to tear each other down is way less interesting than whatever fucked up thing they have going on the show. But the thing that makes me feel the most insane is when I see people say that the show made Rhaenyra so soft in comparison to book Rhaenyra, because here's the thing, when you actually look at the texts and compare, show Rhaenyra's done worse things. She's killed way more people. This notion of the utterly ruthless book Rhaenyra is based on just a few lines as far as I can tell. In the book, after her stillbirth, Rhaenyra blames the Greens for the loss of her daughter and says that they stole her throne and they will answer for it. And that line could signify a desire for revenge against the Greens specifically, not a desire for all-out war. Yes, the show made Rhaenyra reluctant to go to war, but beyond that one line, book Rhaenyra wasn't rearing to burn everything either. She does the same thing as her show counterpart. She doesn't immediately send her dragons off to war. She marshals her allies and sends her sons off to deliver her messages. It's true that book Rhaenyra doesn't even consider Aegon's terms. She responds with, "Tell my half-brother that I will have my throne or I will have his head." She expresses no concern for the realm, only her own power. But show Rhaenyra has been given more reasons to consider the terms and fear dragon war. She has her relationship with Alicent that gives her some amount of trust in the other side. She has her father's warnings about dragon warfare and a concern for his legacy. And she doesn't end up accepting the terms either. I think that Rhaenyra wishing to avoid war at first is just more compelling in terms of her long-term character arc, and story-wise, the fact that Rhaenyra was considering the terms makes it even more tragic and consequential when Aemond kills Luke. Sure, show Rhaenyra is a better person in this regard, but she is by no means softer. In the book, after Luke's death, Rhaenyra becomes catatonic with grief and locks herself away and lets her council conduct the war without her. And the Red Sewing is all organized by Jace in the book, but the show has Rhaenyra take control of that and puts the responsibility for the mass loss of life on her. Book Rhaenyra is sobbing in her room when show Rhaenyra is basking in the light of burning human sacrifices because she believes herself ordained by the gods. The show also emphasizes the harm being done by Rhaenyra's blockade. She was starving out the small folk of King's Landing all season. That was a key plot point. And she may have been hesitant, but she still ordered the deaths of thousands in this episode. And one of the main examples I see cited for the show whitewashing Rhaenyra is faking Laenor's death and letting him run away instead of having him killed. And yeah, they didn't want to have her actually murder Laenor because that would look bad. And I also think the decision to have Laenor run away instead of being killed was made to subvert the bury your gaze trope, but that's a whole other conversation. But Rhaenyra is never connected to Laenor's death in the book. Fire and Blood says that either Qarl killed him for gay reasons or Daemon orchestrated it. Obviously, we don't know what really happened, but Rhaenyra is never implicated. This isn't whitewashing the character, it's refraining from making her worse. or at least not that much worse, because the plan still involved killing an innocent man. And it's Rhaenyra's idea. She approaches Daemon. She proposes they marry, knowing that someone has to die for it. Maybe there was a good outcome for someone, and it seems less brutal to the audience, but it's not really morally better. Rhaenys and Corlys still lost their son. Jace and Luke still lost the father who raised them. I think that's another win for show Rhaenyra in the Dirty Deeds competition. Rhaenyra is the protagonist of their show, and they want their protagonist to be someone you might root for, at least at first. And that's not a bad thing. People critique the show for not having any likable characters as is. Yes, people love Succession, but the Roys weren't murdering thousands of people with their dragons. This is a different kind of show. And I don't know what the future holds, but it seems to me like they are giving Rhaenyra something like Daenerys' arc done right. She starts off as someone who intends to do good. She doesn't want to rule over the ashes, but she slowly becomes more and more corrupted. And for that to work, she can't be completely brutal from the jump. I really don't think you can make the judgment that the show is trying to soften Rhaenyra until we actually get her full series-long character arc. Alright, just some miscellaneous notes here. I thought that the Thailand and Tyrosh scenes were fun. I am an unironic Tywin Lannister stan, and I think that Jefferson Hall has done a tremendous job playing the Lannister twins. You can see the difference just in posture and attitude without him speaking a line. And I really enjoyed Abigail Thorne as Shiraka Lohar. One of the disappointments of Thrones was its refusal to adapt the wackier elements of this world, and I'm glad that this show has embraced them. But these scenes don't belong in a season finale. They are clearly a relic of a 10-episode season that would pay off on the Triarchy plotline in the next 2 episodes. Also, Shiraka's palace is the brothel set redressed. Budget cuts, baby. So, the Rhaena scenes. It seems pretty clear at this point that Rhaena will be taking the Nettles storyline from the book and claiming that dragon. And I hate that Nettles is being eliminated because she's such an interesting figure, but I understand why they would do this, and I do think there are interesting ways they could go with it, and I am very glad that it will give Phoebe Campbell more to do because they have been fantastic with what little they've been given. The ideal choice would have been to give Rhaena an entirely original storyline, but that's not nearly as simple as it sounds to create a new plotline in the Vale that doesn't feel tacked onto the story. But if they are going to do this, they could have handled it much better. They do effectively convey how alienated Rhaena feels as the only Targaryen without a dragon, but that's pretty much all we've had of her characterization. Does it make sense that she could have chased down a dragon on foot? I mean, I guess it's believable that she studied a ton about dragons and would know about tracking them, but still. But I do love Sheepstealer's design. Look at his weird little face. He's so ugly, I love him. Sir Simon Strong remains the best. He is dripped out, he's loyal to his queen, he's a messy bitch who loves drama, he is utterly precious and nothing bad is allowed to happen to him ever. Sorry nerds, but I didn't like the Green Man unless they're actually going to give an explanation of why it would be at Harrenhal. I love that the show is embracing the magical elements of this world, but it needs to be done thoughtfully, not just throwing things at the screen. And I know I talked about it in my last review, but I still think that tiny Cyrax is a huge problem. I know it won't be fixed, and I understand there are better uses for the dragon budget, but again this week we had Cyrax try to be intimidating, and she's just so tiny, it doesn't work. Okay, so I just wanted to discuss some of my overall criticisms of the season that I don't think can be attributed to larger production issues. And I think honestly probably the biggest one for me, and I think honestly probably the biggest one for me is that I think that the show dedicates too much time to its 3 leads at the expense of other characters. Alicent and Rhaenyra are my 2 favorite characters on the show, and I loved every second of Daemon doing ghost therapy and making friends with a hot witch. But all of their storylines could have been streamlined, and I think a lot of other characters would have hugely benefited from just a little bit more screen time. I really wish that Jace had had more to do. I thought he was great. And Helena, I know I already talked about earlier in this review. I know I've also talked about in earlier reviews how I thought that Aemon's character arc in the first half of the season was very disappointing. And I think that all these characters really needed was just a little bit more screen time, and their storylines would have been vastly improved. And this show can be incredibly subtle with its characterizations. I think there is some very beautiful, subtle character work in this season, but it also can be incredibly heavy-handed sometimes. A considerable amount of the viewing audience is still missing the point somehow, but I think that they were always going to miss the point, so you don't need to cater to that audience. I think catering to a whiny audience is one of the easiest ways to devalue your work. In terms of individual characters, I think that Corlys was probably the biggest disappointment. I think that Steve Toussaint is fantastic, and Corlys is such a cool character. He just didn't get really much of anything to do this season. I did like the stuff with Adam and Alan because legacy has always been a huge part of his character. I think that's a good thing to explore, but it was just way too slow played and felt very repetitive, and his storyline just kind of floundered. And I know I've talked about the Laenor issue before, but it still remains so glaring that that's never ever come up. That should be creating tension between him and Rhaenyra. I was also very frustrated with Bella and Rhaena's storylines. Now, I am sympathetic to the fact that there is no real book material for these characters. They're just not doing anything at this point in the book, so the show does have to invent things here. But still, there's still just not a lot of characterization for either of them. Bella got to do like one cool dragon thing, and then it was mostly just being emotional support for other characters. And the fact that the characters whose storylines feel the most underwritten are Black is not great. I thought that Adam and Alan were relatively well handled. Their storyline was also pretty slow played, but they got about the same as the other Dragon Seeds, and I loved Maester Orwyle. I'm a Maester Orwyle fangirl now. That's my guy. But that's half of the Black characters on this show who feel very underserviced. I like that they are trying to add diversity to this world, but if you're going to do that, you need to follow through and actually give these characters something. And I do think that the season struggled with momentum. There were some major events that happened, and they did affect the story going forward, but it just never felt like they carried enough weight, like there wasn't enough characters reflecting on the horrors and being changed by them, maybe. I feel like this season should have been like a big snowball of grief that just picks up new horrors and gets bigger and bigger as it rolls along, but it never quite felt like the stakes were building as much as they should be. And I think that probably some of that is because the season had to be kind of reshuffled last minute, but I don't think all of it was. The Dance of the Dragons is fundamentally a story about grief and how it tears families and nations apart. Sin begets sin begets sin. Jaehaerys' death is barely mentioned after episode 2. Helena is clearly affected, and I don't mind her expressing and manifesting her grief in unconventional ways, but she pretty much just disappears from the narrative for most of the season. Aegon is out partying with his buddies like nothing is wrong in episode 3, and I feel like Blood and Cheese really should have shaken the Green Coalition a lot more. Like, it was really weird to me that nobody blamed Aemond, even though he was the intended target and it was in retribution for something he did. Like, it really felt like they should have been mad at him, and that should have increased the tensions between him and Aegon and him and Alicent. Aegon is out partying again in episode 3 like nothing ever happened, and I really feel like Blood and Cheese should have stirred things up more within the Green Coalition. Like, it's very bizarre to me that nobody blamed Aemond even though he was the intended target and it was in retribution for something he did. Like, I really feel like that should have increased tensions between him and Aegon and him and Alicent, but he's just completely disconnected from all of them. Luke is barely mentioned after his funeral. There's a heart-to-heart between Jace and Bela in the next episode, but he's just briefly mentioned at the end. We see Rhaena sobbing at his funeral, but we never get to hear her talk about it. Luke was her betrothed, and she clearly cared for him quite a bit. Like, that should be part of her motivation to get involved in the war, part of the reason she feels like she needs to do something, but we just don't get any of that. Rhaenyra's traumatic stillbirth from the end of last season is never mentioned. Rhaenys is barely mentioned after episode 5. It feels like we get one episode to mourn for a character after they die, and then just everything moves on, but that's not how grief works. This is a huge part of why, while I think that every individual episode of this season was decent to fantastic, the season as a whole just didn't quite land as it should have. And finally, the biggest, the most glaring issue with this season that's completely egregious and outrageous and an insult to me personally, Otto Hightower was only in 2 episodes. How fucking dare you?
Thoughtless. Feckless.
This is an injustice that must be corrected in season 3. Who knows where they're going with this character? Clearly, it's something different from the books. There was no kidnapping plotline in the books. Whatever gets Reese Fons on my screen more is great with me, but he should have been in season 2 more. Why isn't Otto Hightower in every single scene? Where's George R. R. Martin's blog entry about that? Alright, that's it. Thank you so much for everyone who watched until the end. I know that this one took a little while. I am working on that adaptation video. I'll say that that should be out in 2 weeks, but who knows really?